generally, what that lesson was about was flexing. So it fits into that middle circle because that's the global pattern that we kept on exploring with variations. So what were the local relationships? Breathing was always a part of it. The actual things. The actual things. No, the stairs is that's the 4. Going stairs is the function. Yeah. So the local relationship is the relationship of bringing your right elbow to your right knee, or lifting your head with your hands helping. So you are addressing very specific components that might go into, so components will go into the overall flexion theme, and then that overall flexion theme is good for certain functions. All right, so we're addressing very specific aspects that are about this theme of flexion. Then the theme of flexion can be applied in many different functions or tasks or actions in Zoran's words. So you could use those kinds of words. In my world, we call them tasks. So we get task-specific training, for example. We actually practice the task. So if you do one of Larry's workshops, he's got a lot of other sort of ways of explaining these things and giving examples, but we can keep it quite simple because it fits, I think in that lesson, it fits very neatly. So there was quite a few different local relationships that we addressed. So the first one was simply the idea of the head flexing into the trunk, towards the trunk, with using so we think about why about all of that stuff? Why did we do all of that stuff? So someone's lying here on the floor. Why have your hands behind your head? Yep. So you can all do it. Lie on the floor and lift your head without your hands and with your hands. And what's the difference? If you use your hands, you use more of yourself. And you do make your neck disappear to a point. It doesn't disappear entirely. It's not a complete. Can you feel how the movement shunts much quicker down into your chest, your sternum, and your belly? And it's much more likely that the whole of your spine picks up when it's just your head. Yeah? Because your head is really heavy. There's a couple of reasons why this is so. You can feel it, but your head is really heavy, and when you go to lift it up on its own, you'll just use your neck flexors to a point. Now then, of course, once you've used your arms and you go back to lifting your head, you've reminded yourself, oh, I can actually help lift my head by using my abdominals. And so your head actually feels lighter after you've used your arms, because your arms have shown you that it helps to lift your head by using your abdominals and flattening the small of your back and flexing your chest forward. That's the point of it. So in some lessons, you'll lift the head first without the arms, feel that it's bloody awful, and you'll feel all the strain and the work in your neck because that's the only thing that you're using to lift. Then you do the arms, and that shunts the movement further down. It invites the chest to fold because it doesn't let the neck do the work because you've effectively constrained it by this triangle. Often constraints are a triangle, according to Dr. Goldfarb. I don't think they always are. I don't think they always are. But that's okay. I'm not an absolutes person. I just always get nervous when they say that. Always. Always. Anyway. I know. It's pretty absolute. So that's the thing about that. So the local relationship is the relationship of the head flexing on the chest and then the chest actually flexing on the abdomen. So using all of the front flexors, not just these flexors. So we are using that fantastic nugget of Feldenkrais, which is involve more of yourself. So instead of all the work being done by just these poor little strappy muscles here, or in fact the little tiny muscles I told you about in between each rib that can fold the ribs forward, like bring the ribs closer together, and then this kind of sheet of muscles here for the abdomen, which can pull the chest closer to the pelvis. And that's it. So they're the relationships, the relationship of the head and the chest to the pelvis. Now, why did we do it with your legs long and then the legs bent up?
Harder.
Harder with the legs long. Yeah, and why?
Because the small of the back is raised.
Yes. So the back is already more extended because most of us have a fair bit of tension in our hip flexors. So our hip flexors don't let our legs go completely flat, and because they're attached to the front of our spine, they pull our spine into a little bit of extension, so arching. And so when our legs are long, our back is already extended. So then for it to flex to help lift the leg up, the head up, this thing, head, yeah, legs, head. It's got to come from a more extreme position, from arching into flattening, as opposed to when your legs are up, you've taken the tension off your lower back. It goes more towards a neutral flat position, and then it's easier for it to flex because it's more neutral. Does that make sense? I can repeat it. Yep. Yep. Yeah, and so that means that your back is even flatter. Yeah, so that means that you are now flexing from the bottom end as well as the top end if your head's up. So you can feel that if your knees come up over your chest, then you are flexing your lumbar spine from the bottom end because you're tilting your pelvis back. All right, is everybody happy with that? If you're not happy, say it doesn't, because it doesn't matter. Well, you don't have to be happy about it. You don't have to be like felicidades or whatever, happy, joyous, but just comfortable. Yes. Yep. To have your legs long? Yeah. Yeah. So the question is,
I had to bend them up earlier because it actually would feel like it's going to pull my back.
Yeah. So, and you asked me about it, and I said I was teaching true to the lesson, just to let you know that he does work people quite hard, and he literally did have their legs down. And I guess partly because then he made such a big deal about how they get their legs up. And this is true. If you work with somebody with stroke, they have a real problem often getting the more stroke-affected leg up into standing, and even to keep it there. They might not be able to keep it there. So, yes. Now, here's the important thing, though, is just because it's true for maybe 25% of people that they really struggle having their legs long for the first couple of minutes, I would say it's about 25% of people. Let's do a straw poll. Who, when they lie on their back, has to have their knees bent up? And for me, it's for the first 5 minutes. See, so if you project your thing on everybody else, you got to know the generality of your thing. Otherwise, you've got everybody dealing with your personal constraints that aren't problems for them. So that's why you would say, and I would, if I was teaching that lesson, if you can leave your legs long, do. If you are feeling a bit uncomfortable in the small of your back, bend your knees up now. But why is it important in that lesson to have your legs long? So that you feel what you said, which is it's harder. And then you get a sense of it being easier. So that whole sort of structure of the lesson is lift your head up the hardest way possible first. Oh, wait, no, the hardest way would be just lift your head up without your hands. So he's not that mean, but he's pretty mean. So do it the hardest way possible. Yeah, we did with that. Oh, you did? Oh, there you go. So he's a bastard. Yeah, with the legs long. Yep. So that's the thing. And so that's a classic structure of a lesson is you do the thing in the hardest way possible, then you do all these variations that kind of address all these local relationships that remind your system of all the things that they could do, they could add into this theme to make it easier. And then you come back to the hardest way possible and it's easier. No. The 4 is a function. It's a real world function. A real world function. Lifting your head off the floor. Yeah, a task. Something that's meaningful. Now, you could say lifting your head up like that is a function if you are, and I think maybe he even uses this example, lying on a beach and you want to lift your head up to see somebody attractive walking past. That's a function. That's a function. Yeah, he doesn't say that in this lesson. He says it somewhere else. Yeah. No, he doesn't say it in this lesson. It's another lesson that he and that's a function. As you're lying down. That's a function. So the function has to have meaning. Now, you can find meaning in bizarre movements. You can. But that's the way you have to start thinking to end a lesson so that you can do that, whatever we talked about, the ideas that you already came up with for the end of the lesson last time about going upstairs, which requires flexion to lift your leg up, or, looking down. Now, interestingly, they are using some of those local movements, flexing, but they're actually not controlled by the flexors if you're standing. They're controlled by the extensors. Because if I lower my head here, this is not flexion. My head is flexing because my extensors are letting go, are lowering it. But there's no activity. My flexors are completely soft. So I'm not actually using exactly the same muscle activity, but I am using the same skeletal relationships and the same overall theme of flexing. Possibly, yeah, it might all be. So the dead bird, you all quite rightly and correctly picked, was more about rotation. There's a global theme there about rotating. And then the addressing was all the little different things like the shoulder going relative to the head and then the head going relative to the eyes. But again, it's a very classic lesson where the global movement pattern is very clear. It's all about rotation. And then with a little bit of extension and flexion, but really only, and then going back into rotation. So not all lessons have such a clear global pattern. But they're all about, let's say the kata is a flexion lesson, a flexion and extension lesson, but it's not, it's taking out all the relationships that we did yesterday. It's actually it's not using those. It's actually getting rid of them to get one very specific relationship of your pelvis to your thighs, to, the hip joint flexion only. So it's a very specific flexion lesson so it's still about, the global movement pattern is about sort of flexion. However, there's a very specific local relationship about the relationship between your pelvis and your femur, your thigh bone.
Susan, I'm being active this morning.
You've been active this morning.
Oh, like isn't asking questions.
That's all right. I thought you've gone for a run.
I've been to ATMs where often at the end, the facilitator, I'm going to call him facilitator instead of teacher, will ask, and how do you think you could apply that?
Yeah.
What do you think, put it to the group. Obviously you want to know so you can feed into that, but actually giving it back to the group to come up with ideas.
Absolutely. Yep. Great. That's a great way to do it because it takes the pressure off you. Have you noticed that Feldenkrais facilitators, the strongest virtue that we have is laziness? Because we're putting all the learning back on the students. I'm not responsible for your learning. I can create the environment. And then it's your sandpit. You play. I'm not going to play for you. I'm not going to build your sandcastles. You are. And I'll give you some advice along the way about, you know, how wet the sand can be or blah, blah, blah. I'm going to string this metaphor out, but it's your sandpit. I'll keep the sandpit safe and I'll put the right tools in it and make sure the sand is good, but it's your sandpit and you play. So therefore, putting that responsibility back is really, really important. I probably wouldn't do it necessarily for a new group, but then why not? He's very tough with new people in a way. And it's not that he's tough. He actually really respects people's inherent intelligence. And he calls it forth. He respects their intelligence enough to be demanding of them. And it's a really interesting distinction that he's not being, you know, bossy or pushy or rough. It's a respect. And if you talk to some of the people who actually have felt his hands, that's how they felt them. The head can look, you know, you've watched some of his FIs, and he looks quite kind of rough. But you talk to any of the folk in Amherst, for example, I said it didn't feel rough. It felt fantastic and respectful and caring, but clear, you know. So there's this quality about giving back this responsibility to the folk on the floor that's done in a way that, so I can joke and say it's because we're lazy. It's actually respectful.
Can I ask a question? How did it sort of transform from his approach, which was, when just a few I've done, where it's not very long rests, he doesn't even call very many rests, and he doesn't speak in a dreamy tone, he just speaks in a normal tone, to the more common experience I've had of an ATM, which is
dreamy,
very slow,
I call that the Californian
deliberate.
Influence. So we've got
rests.
Yeah, we've got Feldenkrais circa, via California, and so I call that the California. I actually call it the California hoo-ha. So it came via San Francisco, or Amherst isn't California, but it came via that 70s and 80s lens of new agey dolphin music.
That is an add-on, not necessarily.
He never taught. I've never heard him in a dreamy voice in any recording I'm looking at my colleagues. Have you ever taught? I can't even imagine Feldenkrais talking in a dreamy la-la voice. The only one. I've never heard him teach that. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, that's an artifact. I think it's an artifact, and it's an add-on. If that's an adaptation that works well, it's fine. It's just that we have to understand that it's an adaptation by a certain group. I think it's really good that we've got an international community, and Jenny's sort of more hooked into the international community than I am. And when I've taught overseas, I've taught in training programs by the people that I know. So so it's kind of transplanted. So I don't actually have an experience, but I hear, and I make jokes about the sort of, there's the Israeli flavour. So, is very gymnastic and very vigorous. Like the handling is very vigorous and the lessons are very gymnastically taught. So quite different from the Californian. You got any other experiences, Jen? Of cultural influences, I guess, is what we're talking about.
The story that I'd heard was that the people that Moshe was often working with, particularly in AY and in that kind of early time, were people who'd come out of highly traumatic experiences during the war. And that to ask them to go all dreamy and internal was not actually a very safe place for them. And that probably partly informed his thinking about how movement was the safe way to help people kind of move on in life and find ways of changing and being able to act differently in the world.
Yeah.
Certainly I've heard lots of people doing the gently voice. And in our culture of madness and rush, then it's a helpful tool to quieten the nervous system and bring people into themselves, which is challenging for many busy people.
Yeah.
But I've also, been to some delightful workshops where people are working as if with a football team. And, that's not quite the style that would go down well there. It needs to be much more kind of clear and direct and have a go. And people do, and it still drops people into that reflective place.
And that's a lovely way of thinking about how, not one of your things you're wanting to look at is how do I pick a theme or a series of lessons. In a way, you also have to pick what your wardrobe is going to be to teach those lessons. So your wardrobe being how you're going to look and how you're going to present yourself. And obviously you don't want to go in disguise, and dress up as, something that you're not and use a voice that you're not. However, it would be good to sort of play around with, well, how will I change my voice? How will I change the pace and the tone and the pitch and, literally even what you wear to fit the audience that you think you're going to have in the room. I'll never forget after our training doing an ATM with one of my colleagues, and this person had been fantastic discipline, studying a lot of ATMs from tapes from the Californian crowd, and this person taught us an ATM with an American accent. So funny. Like completely took on all of that culture to the point of teaching it with an American accent, and this person is not American. They are as Aussie as us. So that's pretty interesting. Unconsciously, we pointed out to this person afterwards, very quietly, and they apparently it was a trait. It was a anyway. That's what it is. But we were addicted to the international
voice.
Oh yeah. You might not use your own.
Yep.
Yeah. It just didn't, because we all know this person really well. It came across as really bizarre. Actually, it wasn't a musical voice. I understand what you're saying, but it wasn't. It was an American accent. Yeah, and I understand that because I'm terrible when I am away. I have to be really careful to not pick up the accent. And then people think that I'm taking the piss, and I'm not. It's just, it is yeah.
Yeah, that happens at international meetings. We all end up speaking some kind of quaint Irish.
Yeah.
Where the verbs and nouns and things change place in the sentence.
Yeah.
But you do kind of fall into that pattern.
Yeah. I lived in South Africa for 6 months, and I developed I can go more, obviously coming from Adelaide, I can go more towards an English accent anyway. But there, because they really struggled with my Australian accent a lot, for some reason, when I want to be clear, I just get even more English. So, by the time of 6 months, I was like, fully fledged UK citizen. And I still do that when I'm teaching overseas. My clear voice gets very English. But anyway. Okay, so getting back to this, the action systems. Addressing local relationships. And that's, can think really sort of skeletally about this. So if we think then, so I think that, I think a lot, don't I, if I listen to myself. That lesson, it's just local relationships, different configurations of bringing body parts in that flexing. So it's the head, getting the neck to disappear. It's the chest folding, but there's the chest folding more with one way than the other way, so you can really clarify. And then it's the legs up so that the pelvis is tipped back, so it's easier to flex the chest and the pelvis together. And then, of course, you bring the legs up and the knee comes so that you're flexing from the other end and this end. So everything's flexing. Is there anything else? And then you cross. Yep. They're all different local relationships. Yep. Yep. No, it's not a side bend, it's a diagonal. It's a flexion, but with a diagonal. If it was a side bend, what would it look like? Yeah. Exactly. So that would be, yeah. So that might be useful. Now, think of some other fours. You don't necessarily know. And that's why it's, Anna's point about leaving it up to them when they've got enough experience, or if you want to honour their intelligence. What would that lesson be good for is the sort of basic phraseology that you could use. And I think you came up with some, putting on your socks, doing up your shoes, coming up from lying, so sitting up. Yep. I have an absolute thing about coming up from lying through flexion, because it's so hard. I don't know why we do it, because it's the hardest thing to do. Roll onto your side. So, and then you're still flexing. Yep. Yep. And then there's a side bend. Yep. You're quite correct. Yeah. Yep.
I remember doing an ATM early on when I first came across Felix, where the four, I think the idea of the four was the idea of like spitting out the toothpaste into the sink.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That was the
leaning over. Yeah. So we're being very literal, and we're imagining functions that have flexion in it. Now there's something else that can happen in this lesson. By flexing, working in the flexors, and then they come back. Some people's feeling after this is that they feel straighter. So it's not necessarily that flexion gets easier, extension gets easier. They get straighter because this works. And you remember we've talked about this. When muscles work a lot, they have a relaxation period afterwards. And we take full advantage of that by saying come back and rest on your back long, so that you're really letting that happen, right? So people could, and they don't know it necessarily, actually feel taller. So this lesson, bizarrely, even though it's flexion, could be really good for reaching up to the top shelf, because now your chest and your belly can open out more.
Yeah, Susan, I wondered just exactly that because what you're doing is you're almost getting people to do, as people get older, they often do kind of punch, but what you're doing is you're almost kind of getting them to punch more.
Yes.
And then to relax
That's
out.
Exactly right.
And, part of the four, I wondered about this, and going back to what you were saying about the PhD too, is that actually the four is, I can't believe I got my elbow quite close to my knee for somebody who normally is hunched over but doesn't kind of do kind of then
back,
forward and back.
Yeah. Yep.
They stay permanently about halfway.
Yeah.
Yeah, painfully halfway.
Yeah, so they're stuck in flexion. And so this lesson also, for particularly for this group, is actually going with the pattern. And then the sneaky thing is coming out with the pattern when they're resting. So the thing that they could feel better is, I feel more comfortable lying on my back. I feel more comfortable being straight. So then the function is lying flat. So lying is still a function. Lying comfortably is a particular function. Sitting comfortably. Sitting is a function. I think Larry always says it's an ing word. The four is often an ing word. Ing word. Ing, sitting, lying, action, a verb, a verbing word. Toing and froing, to sit, to lie, to dream, to fart, to. So, for example, if someone really lets go in their belly, and I had this experience when I was pregnant, letting go in your belly, I remember. I didn't know he was an Eddie then, but he became an Eddie. He dropped because my belly wasn't tight and holding him up really high. My belly got longer with him. He got more space and he dropped. and my diaphragm I could breathe better. So I felt more comfortable, and I felt and breathing from a flexion lesson. And it's quite difficult flexing over a baby. I was about 5 months pregnant, I think. So that's really helpful, really helpful. And then having a nice, long, relaxed belly is really good, because God knows what happens in your pelvic floor. It lets go too with this flexion. I'm not so good at... Who's the pelvic floor king or queen around here? Fran, I guess. So, I encourage you to get the tapes. Deborah Bose has got a great series of ATMs about the pelvic floor, because it's very connected to the flexors. And I would imagine, I haven't, again, this is terribly ignorant, I haven't done all of Alan's pregnant pauses stuff, but a lot of those things are about getting the belly to lengthen, getting the pelvic floor to relax so that you can give birth easier. So that's a big stretch, isn't it? I wouldn't expect people after that class to get up and go, I reckon that lesson would be really good for being pregnant and giving birth. But logically it is really good. So, there's some functions that are obscure and way down the track for somebody that might not be connected, and that's perfectly fine. You don't have to think about all the functions. It's more the process of helping people to link local relationships, global patterns with function in their real life. And that's that bigger picture of integration that I was really excited about that came out in Cliff's interviews, is that people not only felt integrated within themselves, but what they'd learnt on the floor integrated into their lives. So there's that bigger picture of integration, which is really, that's why this is such an important feature of the end of the lesson. So, and I'm not saying labour it and list every possible ing word you can think of about flexing, that, where flexing is in it. However, at least open the conversation so that you're pacing them out the door. So something that you might say, so notice when else in your life do you need to fold like that? Or, you could ask them, so what did you notice in the lesson? They say, I really noticed, how easy it was to straighten up. So, okay, notice when in your life does that need to is that an important component of what you're doing, reaching up to the top shelf? Now, the other thing this is really good for is thinking like this. It's about these local relationships, the global pattern, and the function is you can work the other way. If someone comes in and says to you, I have real trouble playing the violin, and you go, I don't know, I can't play the violin, I can't help you. Then you think, well, that's the 4, playing the violin. So then you can break the task down. And you can do a task analysis, if you like. In my world, that's what it's called. Maybe we'll talk more about this afternoon. We'll do a little session on motor learning. So this breaking the task down, so that then you can think about how you'd construct an FI out of it. You're working from the 4 to the local, in a way. So the 4 is this. So you don't have to play the violin to know that this. So you can just mentally in your mind, okay, this is the 4. What's a global pattern? What's my spine doing, for starters? It's actually quite extended. You can't play. So there's several global patterns here. It's complicated, but it's probably the global pattern isn't as obvious, other than that my spine is extended and there's rotation, because my head has to rotate, but actually my trunk has to stay relatively straight with a bit of, a little bit of a twist. But I don't want to do this, because then if my trunk turns into my arm, then this arm isn't out. See, so it's got this element to it, and then it's got this, one arm is out and one arm is soaring across here. So you think then I'm already going more into into local relationships, because the global pattern is fairly not woolly, it's fairly fixed. Complex. Yeah. So then the local relationships are about, well, do I know the difference between my my shoulders and my chest, for example, because I need my my arm to move relative to my chest, but I don't. What you see with violinists often is that they do fix their chest, but actually it needs to soften and then open. So they need to be able to soften their ribs a little bit, and their sternum does need to move towards and away from this arm. But it's this movement, isn't it? Maybe. I don't know. I don't play the violin. But let's say that's it. And this arm, it needs to be away. It needs to be held. Now, if you just hold that arm, try with a very flexed chest, so that all of the support is in the shoulder, it starts to hurt a lot quite quickly. And then have the whole of you supporting it so that you're lifting it with your pelvis. And for most people, it will feel a bit easier. It'll take the pressure out of the shoulder a bit. Yeah. Right. Yeah. They turn their head to put their chin on it. Yeah. So there's some issues about the head side bending versus rotating. So that's a local relationship. So you can think, well, here's all these weird local relationships that they're sustaining. And so that's the issue, is that there's a sustained quality about these local relationships. So therefore there's likely to be a lot of habitual holding into that relationship, into those local relationships. And actually then you're starting, okay, I'm starting to get a picture of what are the local relationships and what's the likely pattern. And so what could we do from an FI point of view? Go with the pattern. Go with the pattern. And then feel. So you can have a think about the local relationships of the head to the chest in this plane and this plane, whatever, and see, where they want to go more and where they don't want to go, and this and that and the other, where their eyes go, blah, blah, blah. The local relationship of this arm being out and this. And that's why it's difficult, is because this arm is externally rotated and this arm is really internally rotated. So then their scapula will be doing very different things on their chest wall. So you can explore those local relationships. You can explore the local relationships of where their chest folds and where it doesn't fold, and, where it rotates or not. And then, of course, don't forget the pelvis, because remember, that's the answer to everything. So where's their weight? If they're sitting playing, where's their weight? Do they have their weight shift from both sides of their buttock to the and they could do that to help with the playing if they were mobile on there. Now, if you look at really good violinists, like in the symphony orchestras, and they're mostly sitting, and they do sit on the front of their chair and their pelvises are free, and they're weight shifting. It's still quite a habitual weight shift, but that could be some of these local relationships that you're playing with, is that what pattern does their pelvis always make in weight shift as they're playing? And then you could look at where their feet are on the floor and the local relationship there of where their legs are. It will be like the elderly citizen series that we've looked at with just sliding your bottom forwards and backwards. That would be a great exploration for them. Are both hip joints equally free? So you see how you can work from the 4, which is playing a violin, incredibly complex, and work through their system to look at global movement patterns. And there's obviously some really literal ATMs about fiddler's arms, called fiddler's arms, but you don't actually have to be so literal. You can see patterns, and then you can look at those local relationships. And again, in the beginning, you'll probably be very literal, and you will look at internal rotation versus like the shoulder this versus this or something like that. However, then you start getting a little bit more abstract about it. Like some of the ATMs where he gets more abstract, and you can't. Well, what's that local relationship got to do with the global theme? What's the movement pattern, and what's that got to do with the 4? There usually is something. There's something specific, some little bit. But that's the joy of working with some of the complex ATMs, is to figure that out. And then, yep.
I have this thing bubbling up.
Yep.
In me.
I've noticed your face has got this You've got this thinking
and
look
it's
on
not
your
going
face.
to come out like I want it to because it's still bubbling.
Yeah.
But, and it's a bit kind of stemming from what Alison said about currently we're looking at the 4 being a verb, which is it's
A meaningful action.
It's a meaningful action. The stuff that your lovely doctor friend has, and the things that you keep on saying about that people have been doing ATM for a really long time, they're not necessarily honing in on the verbs and the 4, but it is more about themselves being in the world and their interaction with it, with themselves. So it feels like there needs to be another circle, and that it's more than the verb.
Yeah.
That beyond that, yes, send them out with this, let's find something that you can flex and that make that relationship. But for a lot of people, maybe also a bit of a highlight about, their sense of themselves or their emotional state or something else that is sort of self-actualizing that isn't just a function.
Can I just say, for all your preamble about not putting that really well, I think you put it beautifully. And I don't even particularly need to say it again because I think you're absolutely right. There is a whole another thing that could go on the whiteboard about that. I would encapsulate that as the sort of nuggets. Some of the principles that we talked about, like using more of yourself, going slowly, sitting with something, because that's what they talked about in the interviews. So these kind of meta principles of Feldenkrais, these meta ways of processing in a lesson. And they need to be up there too, because they're kind of pervasive across the whole lot. Sorry?
The outer circle may have something to do with the why. What gives this action meaning in this person's life?
Yeah.
So if I can put my socks on, what does that actually mean to me? Is it something about actually having a sense of dignity and retaining my independence? Or if I can play my violin better, is it that, I get my father's respect? And we don't necessarily need to do the psychoanalysis, but recently it seems that the more we can help people at least internally connect to the value of what they're doing, the more we engage their nervous system in doing half the work for us.
Yeah.
Because it will go on that search for meaning and make connections and connect it to the context and bring about that change in the place where it's of value to them. Right.
So these qualities, okay. It is hard to put into words, isn't it? So the other things that they talked about, from what you're saying, is like they felt empowered, and they felt the current buzzword is self-efficacy. They felt like they were the masters of their destiny. Yeah. So they're the kind of meta aspects of They're really, it's a really, really, really important point. And maybe you can ask Zoran that basic orientation. Maybe that's where that kind of fits in there a little bit as well. But you could, in a way, that target can rest in a kind of a bed of those kinds of things. And often it comes out in the self-image, how I feel about myself, and then how I feel about myself in relation to others. How I feel about myself in relation to the environment, which includes people and objects and those sorts of things. Yeah.
Is that what, Jeff Haller has course, and he's kind of expanding a bit more to that a talk I heard with him about more that, Feldenkrais on a big picture, maybe the 4 and why is a bit more that personal transformation.
He will certainly talk about the personal transformation
kind of focusing a little bit more, trying to articulate or trying to promote maybe the benefit of that more to people rather than just that physical functional benefit.
Yeah. So you're right. I mean, and I think this is a really good conversation, but we probably won't persist with it too much longer. is that the target model is very much the action framework of it. And the method is more than this. It is so much more than this. The more than this is quite hard to sell. Yeah. And, I think Jenny alluded to this before, is that Feldenkrais decided that the way to deal with that more than this stuff that you're talking about is through the action systems. It's through an action behaviour, a physical action behaviour, in a way that, whereas Erickson did it more just through thinking or something like that. Yeah, just a couple more comments and then we'll finish.
I just remembered a workshop that I went to with Lisa and Ruth a couple of years ago where you guys did it really beautifully. Like we had, I think you got us all together at the start and were talking to us about what we were doing, but everyone was just talking. I think my memory is that you led us into a conversation of how moving better what that would enable us to do in our lives, and people were talking about wanting to be able to play with their grandchildren, like things that were like really kind of had meaning without being attached to specific tasks at that point.
Yeah.
And then we did the workshop, and I think you really beautifully rounded it off at the end for us. Like people made those connections of what it was that we'd done in the lesson to how that could bring it out and enhance their lives and how they want to feel.
It's a very skillful thing that we can do to help people link it. And I just think one more example of this where actually the 4 can be very metaphorically linked with a state of being. I remember a couple of things, let's say these lessons that we're doing with finding the top of the hip joint, they can be very empowering lessons. And I remember someone saying, I feel like I can stand on my own 2 feet now. Now you can say, well, that's just how it is. I'm more balanced. It's a physical thing. I can stand with more balance. For that person, it meant a whole lot more things about I can stand on my own 2 feet now. I don't have to lean on anybody. I don't have to, wobble. Do you see what I mean? So that's what you're saying, isn't it? Is that there's this whole other possibility that can emerge out of something as simple as standing on 2 feet. So these sort of metaphors. I remember having a lesson from Edna, who was our sort of continuity person. And this sounds a bit gendered, sorry, but it was the 80s. I got this lesson afterwards, and I, walked around after the FI, and I said, I'm walking like a man. Now, that for me meant I was walking really powerfully. I felt powerful. I didn't feel like a man, actually, but that's what popped into my head, because I was really accessing, a lot of hip extension. I was really walking very powerfully. So you could say the 4 is function, it's walking. It had this other quality that I felt so much more like I could walk through this world powerfully and be powerful. Is that, yeah. So this is an even more elusive benefit, but obvious, that it will emerge from their mouths in a way. We don't have to feed into that necessarily. Overtly, implicitly, yes. Explicitly, who knows? Last comment.
I'm figuring, like, just with all this discussion, if you're really to narrow it down, it comes back to the emotional. Like, you could put another circle, it's emotion, because no matter what it is for you, whether it makes you feel powerful or makes you enjoy playing with your grandkids more or whatever it may be, it's an emotion that it can draw out of you because you've been able to do whatever action it is with a lot more ease.
Yes, and I wouldn't give emotions primacy. There's always these 4 things.
Yeah, I mean,
and it's about the integration of these things.
Yeah.
So the 4 is very much about the doing, but always there will be the sensing and the feeling and the thinking involved in it. Absolutely. And those things are the kind of always present in varying ratios. However, for this idea of integration of our whole self, they're present in some way in that to varying degrees. I think that's probably the way to finish off. Great conversation. So I'll try and allude to the 4 about addressing. I'll leave that up there when we're going, and we can kind of pop back into it briefly every now and again with these standing on the top of the hip joint, I think these lessons are called. Because, that's a very sort of, standing on the top of the hip joint is kind of a very, standing is the 4. However, how this might impact on you, what you might notice is different, could be vastly. So have a think, have a feel, have a sense about that. And a do. All right, is it too early for a morning tea break?